Welcome. Let's just make a quick recap. In 2022, Norway revoked Jehovah's Witnesses' official registration and withdrew state subsidies, arguing that the practice of shunning those who leave the congregation, together with its effects on minors, was incompatible with rights protected under national law and the European Convention on Human Rights. Finally, on April 29, 2026, the verdict was in, and the Norwegian Supreme Court ruled in favor of Jehovah's Witnesses. By a mere majority, the court held that shunning was a known internal consequence of the religious system, and therefore not a form of direct coercion violating freedom of conscience. Regarding minors, the court did not say that no problem existed. Rather, it unanimously held that the state had not presented sufficient evidence to justify denying the funds. I want to take a moment to assess the situation, even at the risk of repeating what is obvious, at least among apostates, because some things need to be stated clearly, objectively, and definitively, without room for interpretation. And yes, I am being categorical, for anyone listening, including even the most convinced apologists among Jehovah's Witnesses. Not out of bias, but from a neutral analysis. To me, it's clear anyone is free to believe whatever they want. But as a democratic society, we cannot allow such harmful practices to continue. Beyond the legal technicalities, the Norwegian Supreme Court's ruling represents a monumental failure to understand reality. 3 out of 5 judges chose to rule on a social and psychological dynamic that they quite clearly did not understand at all, ultimately endorsing a distorted and dangerous narrative. They set the threshold for government intervention at such an absurd level that the state is rendered powerless in the face of any abuse that does not manifest itself through blatant physical violence. In this scenario, it almost seems as though public executions would be required to justify withdrawing subsidies, as Jan Frode Nilsen bitterly observed, while ignoring that the systematic destruction of identity and emotional bonds can be a form of torture just as devastating. The court demanded sufficient evidence of harm that is already visible to anyone paying attention, even the most asleep by now, crystallized in decades of shattered lives. But the true insult to logic lies in the majority's conclusions. To claim that family relationships are not severed, even with relatives living outside the home, is a juridical absurdity crying out for condemnation. It is painful to see how the highest court allowed itself to be charmed by shameless falsehoods and semantic games from the defense, which cynically exploited the public's limited understanding of this minority religion in order to pass off a form of social death as free association. That does not require explicit threats to be coercive. The structure itself becomes the threat. When legal systems protect institutional autonomy, while overlooking the crushing consequences imposed on dissenting members, they risk defending power rather than liberty. Let us be clear. Jehovah's Witnesses are not a peaceful community that people simply join and leave according to changing convictions. The system is meticulously designed to make leaving unthinkable and, if it happens, as catastrophic as possible. We are not dealing with people who merely hold strong religious convictions while peacefully coexisting with those who think differently. Those who live inside that cultural bubble inhabit a dystopian reality in which leaving the organization is perceived not as a legitimate exercise of freedom of thought, but as a lucid suicide or a deliberate choice of absolute evil. There is no room for respectful disagreement. Whoever leaves is seen as an enemy of God, a spiritual zombie who has chosen to disconnect their own oxygen supply. Everything was framed around the protection of religious freedom. The central point the judges culpably missed is the paradox of religious freedom. Watchtower itself does not respect religious freedom because, in its worldview, no conceivable life exists outside the structure. If you decide to leave, you cease to be a human being worthy of respect, or even simple acknowledgement, unless you show signs of repentance and submission directed toward returning. It is like choosing to walk outside Earth's atmosphere. To them, it is inherently irrational. There is no accepted possibility of simply changing your mind, perhaps causing sadness among family and friends who might still say, "We are here for you, and if you ever return, we'll be glad." They may privately believe you are risking destruction at Armageddon, yet still show you the minimum respect owed to another human being. No, in their perception of reality, it is like an inexplicable lucid suicide, signing your own death warrant and choosing isolation. Why would anyone do that if they were remotely sane? And so, if you do it, you must strongly feel Jehovah's discipline. In other words, you must suffer as much as possible in order to be driven back into returning. That is the explicitly stated intent, even if you no longer believe. To them, that itself makes no sense. There is no idea to change, no room for human interpretation, and no respect for your human worth if you leave. You are simply wicked. No other motive is considered plausible. So why would they offer respect to an absolute enemy of God and of truth who chooses to leave? To them, such a person is nothing more than a zombie heading for the scrap heap. There is no recognition of alternative ways of life, even if considered mistaken. If you leave, or are expelled for one of the many codified violations within the organization, you are simply disconnecting your oxygen supply while lying in a hospital bed. It makes no sense to them. You are merely mentally diseased and deserving of no humane, common-sense treatment whatsoever, unless you are visibly taking steps toward returning. Otherwise, in their eyes, it is entirely pointless, like exhuming a corpse. Who would do that? This ruling is a grave mistake because it confused the autonomy of an institution with the freedom of individuals. It protected the right of a leadership body to exercise total control instead of safeguarding the right of citizens to change their minds without being annihilated. It was a missed opportunity, a moment when the law could finally have torn away the veil from an oppressive dystopia, and instead chose to close its eyes, allowing semantics to prevail tragically over human dignity. Jehovah's Witnesses are celebrating as though this were a divine victory. Yet they ignore that in court they had to rely on plainly misleading claims and lies in order to deny a reality they themselves created. How can it be a victory for truth when statements so clearly detached from lived reality have now been entered into the record? Thankfully, at least 2 judges understood the matter and placed on record that the reality of shunning exists and is harmful. The fight is not over.